Imagine 50,000 hardened Roman soldiers marching through the streets of Rome, their voices thundering in perfect unison. But they're not singing hymns of glory or patriotic anthems. Instead, they're belting out the most vulgar, sexually explicit songs you could imagine. Songs so obscene that even today's standards would blush. And here's the shocking part. Their commanding officers weren't just allowing it, they were encouraging it. This wasn't rebellion or lack of discipline. This was official Roman military protocol. For over 500 years, the most powerful army in human history had a tradition so bizarre, so seemingly contradictory to military order, that modern historians struggle to believe the ancient sources were telling the truth. But they were. And the reason behind this practice reveals something profound about Roman psychology, military strategy, and human nature itself. What you're about to discover will completely change how you view ancient warfare and challenge everything you thought you knew about Roman discipline. The songs these soldiers sang were so explicit that Roman historians writing about them centuries later had to use euphemisms. Yet somehow, this apparent chaos was actually one of Rome's greatest military innovations. Picture the scene. It's 46 before Christ, and Julius Caesar is celebrating his quadruple triumph for massive military victories that have expanded Rome's borders from Gaul to Egypt. The streets of Rome are packed with hundreds of thousands of citizens, all gathered to witness the greatest military spectacle in the ancient world. The procession begins at dawn. First come the captured treasures: gold, silver, precious artwork stolen from conquered peoples. Then the exotic animals: elephants from Africa, strange beasts from Germania, creatures most Romans have never seen. The crowd roars with approval. But then comes something that would shock any modern observer. The victorious legions begin their march, and as their hobnailed sandals strike the stone streets in perfect rhythm, their voices rise in song. Not the disciplined, respectful hymns you might expect from Rome's elite soldiers. Instead, they're singing verses so crude, so sexually graphic, that they make modern rap battles look like nursery rhymes. The strangest part? Standing just ahead of them in the same procession is their commander, Julius Caesar himself, the most powerful man in the known world. And he's not just tolerating this apparent insubordination. According to the historical records, he's smiling. This wasn't an isolated incident. This was Roman tradition. For centuries, during the most sacred ceremonies in Roman culture, elite soldiers would engage in what can only be described as organized verbal rebellion against their own commanders. They would mock their generals' personal lives, sexual habits, military failures, and physical appearance, all while maintaining perfect military formation. Modern military experts are baffled. How could the most disciplined army in history allow such apparent chaos? How could generals maintain authority while being publicly humiliated by their own troops? And why would a civilization obsessed with honor and respect institutionalize what seems like military suicide? Before we dive deeper into this mystery, let me make a quick invitation. If you're new to the channel and are enjoying this content, subscribe and hit the like button to help the channel grow. Now, let's return to ancient Rome and uncover the brilliant psychology behind one of history's most misunderstood military practices. The truth behind these obscene marching songs reveals a sophisticated understanding of human psychology that modern armies are only beginning to rediscover. What seemed like chaos was actually genius. But to understand why Rome's greatest generals encouraged their soldiers to sing the most vulgar songs imaginable, we need to go back to the beginning and witness how a small Italian city-state created the most effective fighting machine in human history. To understand the shocking tradition of Roman soldiers singing obscene songs, we must first grasp the incredible transformation that Rome underwent from a small Italian city-state to the master of the ancient world. This journey begins in the 8th century before Christ, when Rome was nothing more than a collection of mud huts scattered across 7 hills overlooking the Tiber River. The early Roman army was a far cry from the legendary legions that would later conquer the Mediterranean. These were citizen farmers who dropped their plows when enemies threatened their fields, grabbed whatever weapons they could find, and fought with the desperate courage of men defending their homes and families. They had no professional training, no standardized equipment, and certainly no complex military traditions. But Rome had something its neighbors lacked: an obsession with military innovation born from constant warfare. Unlike the Greeks, who viewed war as a seasonal activity between harvest and planting, Romans found themselves fighting for survival almost continuously. The Italian peninsula was a chaotic patchwork of hostile tribes: Etruscans to the north, Samnites to the east, Greek colonies to the south, and Celtic Gauls who periodically swept down from beyond the Alps like human tsunamis. This constant pressure forged the Roman character in ways that would echo through history. While other civilizations developed art, philosophy, or trade, Romans became specialists in organized violence. Every defeat taught them lessons. Every victory showed them new possibilities. Gradually, almost accidentally, they were creating something the world had never seen. A military machine capable of continuous, professional warfare on multiple fronts. The transformation began around 350 before Christ with a man whose name history has largely forgotten. Marcus Furius Camillus. After Rome was sacked and burned by Celtic invaders, an humiliation that scarred the Roman psyche forever, Camillus began implementing revolutionary changes. He introduced standardized equipment, professional training, and most importantly, a new form of military organization that would become the foundation of the legendary Roman legion. But Camillus understood something that modern military theorists are only beginning to appreciate. Armies are not just collections of weapons and tactics. They are complex psychological ecosystems where morale, unit cohesion, and mental resilience matter as much as sharp swords and sturdy shields. The greatest innovation wasn't technological. It was social. The Roman military system that emerged was built on a simple but revolutionary principle. Transform ordinary men into extraordinary soldiers not through inspiration or patriotic speeches, but through shared hardship, mutual dependence, and carefully managed group psychology. Roman basic training, called tirocinium, was deliberately designed to break down individual identity and rebuild it as part of a collective military organism. Recruits were subjected to months of brutal physical conditioning, weapons training, and most importantly, formation drills that taught them to move, think, and react as a single entity. They marched for hours in perfect synchronization. They ate the same food, slept in identical tents arranged in geometric precision, and were punished collectively for individual failures. The message was clear. Your survival depends entirely on the man next to you. This created an extraordinary level of unit cohesion, but it also created a dangerous psychological pressure. Imagine spending months or years with the same group of men, sharing every hardship, depending on each other for survival, yet being expected to maintain perfect discipline and unquestioning obedience to commanders who might be younger, less experienced, or simply incompetent. Roman military psychologists, though they didn't use that term, recognized that human beings under extreme stress need outlets for the tensions that build up in military life. Suppress those tensions completely, and soldiers become brittle, prone to sudden breaks in discipline at critical moments. Allow complete freedom of expression, and military hierarchy collapses. The solution they developed was both ingenious and seemingly insane: ritualized insubordination. At specific times, under controlled circumstances, Roman soldiers were not just permitted but required to verbally attack their commanders with the most vicious, personal, sexually explicit insults they could devise. This wasn't random rowdiness. It was as carefully regulated as any other military procedure. The songs had specific occasions when they were appropriate, primarily during triumphal processions and certain religious festivals. They followed traditional patterns and rhythms that had been passed down through generations of soldiers. And they served multiple psychological functions that modern military science is only beginning to understand. The origins of this practice can be traced to Rome's earliest religious traditions, specifically the festival of Anna Perenna, where social hierarchies were temporarily reversed and masters served slaves. Romans understood that human societies need pressure valves, moments when normal rules are suspended to prevent the complete breakdown of social order. But the military application was more sophisticated. By allowing soldiers to verbally abuse their commanders in ritualized settings, the Roman army achieved something remarkable. It maintained strict discipline 99% of the time while providing a sanctioned outlet for the frustrations and resentments that inevitably build up in military life. The songs themselves were masterpieces of calculated insolence. They mocked generals' physical appearance, sexual habits, military failures, family backgrounds, and personal weaknesses. They were crude, personal, and often hilariously creative. Roman historians preserve fragments of these verses, though they're often too explicit for literal translation. One song mocked Julius Caesar's alleged affair with the king of Bithynia, calling him the husband of all wives and the wife of all husbands. Another ridiculed Pompey's baldness and sexual inadequacies. Yet another described a general's cowardice in battle using metaphors so graphic that even ancient sources hesitated to record them completely. The psychological brilliance of this system becomes clear when you consider the alternative. In armies without such outlets, resentment builds underground until it explodes in mutiny, desertion, or battlefield collapse. Roman soldiers, having been allowed to voice their complaints in sanctioned ways, actually became more loyal and effective. But there was another layer to this practice that reveals the sophistication of Roman military psychology. The obscene songs weren't just about venting frustration. They were about creating psychological equality between commanders and troops in moments of shared vulnerability. But what Ninguém esperava was that this bizarre tradition would become one of Rome's most powerful weapons against enemy morale, and the psychological effects would extend far beyond the Roman army itself. The true genius of Rome's obscene military songs became apparent not in the training camps or even during the triumphal processions, but on the battlefields where psychological warfare often decided the outcome before the first sword was drawn. What Roman commanders discovered was that these seemingly chaotic vocal traditions had transformed their legions into something their enemies had never encountered. An army that was simultaneously perfectly disciplined and utterly unpredictable. The first recorded instance of Roman soldiers using their singing tradition as a weapon of war occurred during the siege of Veii in 396 before Christ. The Etruscan city had withstood Roman attacks for nearly a decade, its massive walls seemingly impregnable. The siege had dragged on so long that both armies had settled into a routine of daily skirmishes and lengthy standoffs. Then something extraordinary happened. During one of these routine confrontations, the Roman soldiers spontaneously began singing their traditional obscene songs, but they adapted the lyrics to mock the Etruscan defenders. Instead of targeting their own commanders, they turned their verbal artillery on the enemy, describing in graphic detail what they planned to do to the Etruscan women once the city fell, mocking the masculinity of the defenders, and creating increasingly elaborate insults about Etruscan culture and religion. The psychological effect was devastating. The Etruscans, who had maintained their morale through months of siege, found themselves facing an enemy that seemed immune to the normal psychological pressures of warfare. These Romans weren't just disciplined soldiers following orders. They were enthusiastic participants in their own military campaigns, men who could joke and laugh while simultaneously preparing for lethal combat. Roman military commanders quickly recognized the strategic value of this discovery. What had begun as an internal pressure valve had evolved into an external weapon. The obscene songs became a form of psychological warfare that exploited a fundamental weakness in enemy psychology: the human need to maintain dignity and respect in the face of public humiliation. Marcus Claudius Marcellus, one of Rome's greatest generals during the Second Punic War, became the master of this technique. When facing Hannibal's forces in southern Italy, Marcellus discovered that Carthaginian soldiers, trained in the formal military traditions of North Africa, were particularly vulnerable to the Romans' chaotic vocal attacks. During the siege of Syracuse in 213 before Christ, Marcellus ordered his legions to begin each day's assault with a coordinated singing campaign. Thousands of Roman voices would rise in unison, delivering carefully crafted insults about Carthaginian culture, Hannibal's leadership, and the sexual practices of North African soldiers. The songs were performed with the same precision as any military maneuver, but their content was pure, calculated chaos. The defenders of Syracuse, led by the famous mathematician Archimedes, had prepared ingenious mechanical defenses, including the legendary heat rays that could allegedly burn Roman ships at a distance. But they had no defense against an enemy that treated warfare as a combination of deadly serious business and elaborate joke. The psychological pressure proved more effective than any siege engine. But the Romans weren't content to use this weapon only against foreign enemies. During the social wars of the 1st century before Christ, when Rome faced rebellions from its Italian allies, the obscene songs became a tool for distinguishing loyal troops from potential traitors. Roman commanders would order singing sessions and carefully observe which soldiers participated enthusiastically and which seemed reluctant or uncomfortable. This created a fascinating paradox. To prove their loyalty to Rome, soldiers had to demonstrate their willingness to mock and humiliate Roman authority. The system worked because it identified men who truly understood Roman military culture versus those who were simply going through the motions of obedience. The most dramatic example of this psychological warfare occurred during Julius Caesar's conquest of Gaul. The Celtic tribes of modern-day France and Germany had their own rich traditions of pre-battle rituals, including elaborate war chants, ceremonial weapons displays, and ritualized challenges between champions. These traditions were designed to intimidate enemies and boost the morale of Celtic warriors. Caesar's legions turned these Celtic traditions into a weakness. When facing the massive army of Vercingetorix at the siege of Alesia in 52 before Christ, Caesar ordered his soldiers to respond to every Celtic war chant with their own obscene Roman songs. But instead of singing in Latin, the Romans sang in broken Celtic, deliberately mispronouncing words and creating crude parodies of sacred Gallic religious hymns. The effect was psychologically devastating. The Gauls found their most sacred military traditions being turned into crude jokes by foreign invaders who didn't even bother to pronounce their language correctly. It was cultural humiliation on a massive scale, designed to break the spiritual connection between Celtic warriors and their ancestral fighting traditions. Roman military historians noted that Celtic resistance began to crumble not after major battlefield defeats, but after prolonged exposure to these psychological attacks. Warriors who had fought bravely for months began deserting or surrendering, not because they feared Roman weapons, but because they could no longer maintain their cultural identity in the face of constant, systematic mockery. The sophistication of this psychological warfare becomes even more apparent when you examine how Roman commanders adapted their singing campaigns to different enemies. Against the disciplined Macedonian phalanxes, Romans would sing songs that mocked the rigid formation fighting and celebrated the flexibility of legion tactics. Against Germanic tribes, the songs focused on Roman civilization versus barbarian chaos. Against Eastern armies from Syria or Persia, the lyrics emphasized Roman masculinity versus Eastern effeminacy. Each campaign saw the development of new songs specifically designed to exploit the psychological weaknesses of particular enemies. Roman military intelligence gathering included detailed studies of enemy religious beliefs, cultural practices, and social hierarchies, all to create more effective insults and psychological attacks. But perhaps the most revealing aspect of this tradition was how it affected the Romans themselves. Soldiers who spent years singing obscene songs about their enemies developed a particular kind of psychological resilience. They became immune to verbal intimidation because they had mastered the art of verbal aggression. They maintained high morale in desperate situations because they had learned to find humor in the worst circumstances. This created a feedback loop that made Roman armies increasingly effective over time. Each generation of soldiers inherited not just weapons and tactics, but an entire psychological framework for dealing with the stress, boredom, fear, and chaos of military life. The obscene songs weren't just entertainment. They were a form of psychological conditioning that prepared men for the mental challenges of warfare as much as physical training prepared them for combat. The tradition reached its peak during the early imperial period, when Roman armies were campaigning simultaneously on frontiers from Britain to Mesopotamia. Soldiers serving in Germania would adapt their songs to mock the local tribes, while legions in Egypt would develop completely different lyrics targeting the cultural peculiarities of North African enemies. However, what was about to happen would surpass all expectations and reveal secrets that had remained hidden for millennia. The Romans were about to discover that their obscene military songs had created something far more powerful than just an army. They had accidentally engineered a cultural revolution that would transform the very nature of Roman identity. The transformation that Roman military songs underwent during the height of the empire reveals one of history's most extraordinary examples of accidental social engineering. What began as a simple military tradition evolved into something that fundamentally altered how Romans understood themselves, their relationship to authority, and their place in the world. The obscene songs didn't just make better soldiers, they created an entirely new form of Roman identity that would outlast the empire itself. The breakthrough moment came during Emperor Trajan's campaigns in Dacia between 101 and 106 after Christ. For the first time in Roman history, the empire was fielding armies composed not just of Roman citizens, but of auxiliary troops drawn from dozens of conquered peoples: Germans, Gauls, Spaniards, Africans, and Middle Easterners. These men spoke different languages, worshipped different gods, and had completely different cultural backgrounds. Traditional Roman military discipline, based on shared cultural values and common social expectations, should have been impossible to maintain. Yet something remarkable happened. The obscene songs became a universal language that transcended cultural barriers. Auxiliary soldiers who couldn't speak Latin fluently could still participate in the ritualized mockery sessions. The crude humor, sexual references, and irreverent attitude toward authority translated across cultural boundaries in ways that formal military commands never could. Roman military commanders discovered they had accidentally created the world's first truly multicultural military institution. The obscene songs served as a cultural initiation ritual that transformed foreign recruits into Romans not through forced assimilation, but through shared irreverence. A Germanic tribesman and a North African merchant's son could bond over their mutual participation in mocking their Roman officers, creating a loyalty that went deeper than mere obedience. This had profound implications that extended far beyond military effectiveness. The auxiliary soldiers who served their terms and received Roman citizenship didn't just return to their homelands as veterans. They returned as carriers of a revolutionary new cultural attitude. They had learned that authority could be simultaneously respected and mocked, that hierarchy could coexist with equality, and that social order was strongest when it included sanctioned outlets for rebellion. The impact on Roman society was transformative. By the 2nd century after Christ, the culture of ritualized irreverence had spread from the military into civilian life. Roman theater began incorporating the crude humor and political satire that had originated in military camps. Religious festivals adopted elements of the soldiers' mock ceremonies. Even the imperial court began tolerating levels of satirical commentary that would have been unthinkable in earlier periods. Emperor Hadrian, himself a military veteran who had participated in the obscene song traditions, actively encouraged this cultural evolution. He understood that an empire spanning 3 continents and encompassing hundreds of different peoples could not be held together by force alone. The Roman military had accidentally discovered a social technology that created unity through diversity, loyalty through irreverence, and strength through apparent chaos. The most dramatic demonstration of this principle occurred during the Bar Kokhba revolt in Judea between 132 and 135 after Christ. The Jewish rebels, led by Simon Bar Kokhba, had created a sophisticated guerrilla warfare campaign that exploited their intimate knowledge of local terrain and their absolute commitment to their religious cause. Traditional Roman military tactics were proving ineffective against an enemy motivated by religious fanaticism. Hadrian's solution was revolutionary. He ordered his legions to adapt their obscene songs to include Hebrew and Aramaic phrases, creating crude parodies of Jewish religious hymns and cultural practices. But instead of simply mocking the rebels, the Romans began incorporating Jewish soldiers who had remained loyal to Rome into their singing sessions, allowing them to create their own irreverent commentary on the rebellion. The psychological effect was devastating to the rebel cause. Bar Kokhba's movement depended on maintaining absolute religious purity and cultural separation from Roman influence. When Jewish communities began hearing Roman soldiers singing crude jokes in Hebrew about the rebellion, jokes that included participation from other Jews, the ideological foundation of the revolt began to crumble. The rebellion collapsed not through military defeat but through cultural subversion. Communities that had supported Bar Kokhba began questioning whether resistance was possible against an enemy that could absorb and transform their own cultural expressions. The Romans had weaponized their own cultural flexibility, turning their apparent lack of dignity into a strategic advantage. But the most profound revelation about Roman military songs emerged from an unexpected source: the early Christian Church. As Christianity spread throughout the empire during the 2nd and 3rd centuries after Christ, many converts were military veterans who brought elements of their military culture into their new religious communities. Christian writers like Tertullian and Origen noted with alarm that some Christian congregations had begun incorporating adapted versions of military songs into their worship services. The crude sexual content was removed, but the irreverent attitude toward traditional authority structures remained. Christian soldiers were applying the same psychological techniques they had learned in the military to their relationship with religious hierarchy. This created a fascinating paradox. The same cultural innovations that strengthened Roman military discipline were simultaneously undermining the rigid social hierarchies that the empire depended on. The obscene songs had taught an entire generation of Romans that authority was most effective when it allowed itself to be mocked. But this lesson was now being applied to contexts far beyond military life. The long-term consequences became apparent during the crisis of the 3rd century, when the Roman Empire faced simultaneous challenges from barbarian invasions, economic collapse, and political instability. Traditional historical analysis focuses on military and economic factors, but there was also a cultural dimension. Romans had become so accustomed to irreverent attitudes toward authority that they struggled to maintain the kind of unquestioning obedience that crisis situations demanded. Yet this same cultural flexibility also provided the empire with unprecedented resilience. When faced with existential threats, Roman society demonstrated a remarkable ability to adapt, absorb foreign influences, and reinvent itself without losing its essential character. The military song tradition had accidentally created a culture that was simultaneously stable and flexible, conservative and revolutionary. Modern military psychologists studying historical Roman practices have identified what they call controlled irreverence as one of the most sophisticated leadership techniques ever developed. The Roman system achieved something that continues to challenge modern military organizations: maintaining strict operational discipline while simultaneously allowing subordinates to express frustration and resentment in controlled ways. Contemporary special forces units and elite military organizations have begun experimenting with adapted versions of Roman techniques, recognizing that psychological resilience often matters more than physical training in determining military effectiveness. The crude humor and ritualized mockery that scandalized 19th-century historians are now being studied as cutting-edge examples of organizational psychology. The ultimate revelation is that Rome's obscene military songs represent something far more significant than a historical curiosity. They provide evidence of human psychological principles that remain relevant today: that authority is strongest when it allows itself to be questioned, that loyalty is deepest when it includes the freedom to dissent, and that social order is most stable when it provides outlets for the inevitable tensions that arise in hierarchical organizations. The legacy of these crude, vulgar, seemingly chaotic military traditions extends far beyond ancient history into fundamental questions about leadership, authority, and human nature that continue to shape our world today. The story of Rome's obscene military songs reveals a profound truth that echoes through history. The most enduring forms of power are those that understand and embrace human contradiction. For over 5 centuries, the Roman Empire maintained its dominance not despite allowing its soldiers to mock their commanders, but precisely because it did. What began as a simple pressure valve evolved into one of history's most sophisticated systems of social control and military effectiveness. The Romans accidentally discovered that human beings are most loyal when they are allowed to be disloyal in controlled ways, most obedient when permitted moments of rebellion, and most unified when given opportunities to express their divisions. This wasn't just military innovation. It was a revolution in understanding human psychology. While other ancient civilizations built their power on fear, rigid hierarchy, and absolute obedience, Rome created something more flexible and ultimately more durable. A system that channeled human nature rather than trying to suppress it. The crude jokes and sexual innuendos weren't just entertainment. They were social technology that solved fundamental problems of leadership and authority. The implications extend far beyond ancient warfare. Modern democratic societies face the same challenge that confronted Roman commanders: how to maintain order and effectiveness while allowing dissent and criticism. The Roman solution, ritualized irreverence within structured boundaries, offers insights that remain relevant today. Political satire, comedy shows that mock authority figures, and even social media platforms that allow citizens to vent frustration serve similar psychological functions to those ancient military songs. Perhaps most remarkably, the Roman system worked because it was honest about human nature. Instead of pretending that soldiers would never resent their commanders, Romans institutionalized that resentment. Instead of expecting perfect respect for authority, they created official opportunities for disrespect. Instead of demanding constant dignity, they scheduled regular moments of chaos. This honesty created trust between leaders and followers that went deeper than mere obedience. Roman soldiers knew their commanders understood their frustrations, acknowledged their grievances, and were secure enough in their authority to withstand public mockery. This created a psychological bond that proved stronger than fear-based discipline in the crucial moments when battles hung in the balance. The tradition also reveals something profound about cultural resilience. The Roman Empire survived for over a millennium in the West and 15 centuries in the East, partly because it had learned to absorb, adapt, and transform influences from conquered peoples. The obscene songs became a mechanism for cultural integration that allowed the empire to grow stronger through diversity rather than being weakened by it. Looking back across 2 millennia, we can see that those crude, vulgar, seemingly undisciplined military songs represented something extraordinary. A civilization that was secure enough in its values to allow them to be questioned, confident enough in its authority to permit rebellion, and wise enough to understand that the strongest bonds are forged not through force, but through shared laughter at the absurdities of power. The Romans marched singing obscene songs because they understood a truth that many leaders still struggle to grasp. Sometimes the best way to maintain respect is to allow yourself to be ridiculed, and the strongest authority is that which can laugh at itself. If you made it this far and aren't subscribed yet, subscribe now, hit that like button, and share in the comments what surprised you most about Roman military psychology. Until the next video.